Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is the second episode of 50 Trips Around the Sun, and I welcome you. I'm so glad you're watching. The first episode got some decent views, some good comments. I'm not sure how many of you people watched the whole thing. I can't say for sure at this moment how long this one will be. I generally do these in one take and just edit in the little pieces. It's obvious I just got home from work. I'm wearing my tie. I figured I'd just leave it on, make me look professional, like I know what I'm talking about, and we'll just see. I wanted to get this done before February 1st, because I really wanted to get a second episode out in January, and then start to do them on the weekend. I really got sidetracked by my sumo coverage on my All Sumo channel, and I was not productive during that time, because I'm so focused on sumo. But let's just jump right in. So, I turned 1 year old. I was born in 1969, but I turned 1 year old in 1970. And that is the focus of this episode of 50 Trips Around the Sun. 1970, the year 1970. Not a lot of personal recollection for me, because obviously I was an infant. I think my parents moved house, possibly, when I was one. Or in 1970, I think my sister said, my older sister, we moved to the house that I know as my house growing up in Thousand Oaks, California, which is where I grew up until the age of 8 when we moved to Texas. And of course, that'll come in later episodes. So I'm just going to jump right in with stuff I liked in 1970 and about 1970. Again, I'll put timestamps down in the description box. So if you just want to jump to movies or just want to jump to world events, feel free. If you watch all the way to the end, I will send you a Japanese Pepsi. I really won't, but, we can talk about it. Here we go. I might get interrupted. We'll see. The lady that comes to... I get an English language newspaper, which many of you have seen if you watch the channel. I show it all the time on the channel. She might come to collect her monthly fees because it's the 30th today. And she usually comes around the 29th, 30th. So I guess I'll just have to make an edit. There you go. All right, 1970. Music. Let's start with music. My favorite subject. Lots of music paraphernalia around. Of course, I'm a big Beatles fan. And hey, they're going to focus heavy in this episode. But we're going to start with, speaking of the Pepsi that I was just thinking, I'm going to have a little drink. Wet the whistle. Cheers. Kanpai. That light that I've got shining on me to not be completely, really giving me the shadow over here and stuff. So, the big album... The number one album in the country in the United States in 1970. Huge hit album, huge hit single. The title track of the album, as well as other singles, was Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. A phenomenal album. This is a box set I actually bought. Their complete albums collection. And because, I'm old and I still buy these things called CDs. So they had 5 studio albums, a live album, greatest hits album. And then, of course, after they broke up, they got back together and did other things. So Bridge Over Troubled Water, Cecilia, Song for the Asking, the title track. Just so many great songs on here. Boxer, it's just really favorite songs. And record of the year, song of the year, album of the year at the Grammys for 1970. Number one, like I said, most sales of an album that year. They outsold the Beatles, Let It Be. So, we often talk about greatest this, greatest that. And I think if you're just talking about greatest lyricist, in rock music, let's say, in popular music, you'll often hear Lennon and McCartney, you'll hear Bob Dylan, you might hear some of the Motown people like Smokey Robinson, who wrote a lot of their great hits. I think Paul Simon has to be, Jagger and Richards from the Stones. I think Paul Simon has to be in that conversation in the top 5. Van Morrison, Ray Davies of the Kinks, Joe Jackson, Elvis Costello. I mean, there's so many, but definitely Paul Simon for me is probably top three, if not top five for sure. Not only the Simon and Garfunkel material, which is outstanding, and if you've never heard, stuff from Simon and Garfunkel, you run right out now. Stop watching this video. But all the solo stuff too, leading up to his masterpiece, which is Graceland, which we'll get to when we get to that year. So let me play a little bit of Paul Simon for you right here. I'm going to try to show a graphic and then play a song. Now, when I played the songs, it's copyright music, hey. But I thought, if I keep it under 10 seconds, maybe it's like you can review things and just play a little. Nope. I got flagged for a couple songs, so here we go. Let's just play a little snippet here.
Here is my song for the asking. Ask me and I will play.
All right. Like I said, I'm learning how to edit this together to make that interesting. So that's a little bit of Simon and Garfunkel, the biggest album of 1970. What other music was making waves in 1970? Well, there's a little band with Ozzy Osbourne called Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, I'm not a huge metal fan. I'm not a huge Black Sabbath fan. Of course, I know their second album, which also came out in 1970, called Paranoid, which has War Pigs, Paranoid, and Iron Man, which of course regained fame when it was used in the Iron Man movie in 2008. War Pigs is probably my favorite song of theirs. It's amazing. Let me just play the little bit of Ozzy starting War Pigs right here.
Generals gathered in their masses, just like witches at
so
black
good.
masses.
But they actually released their debut album, which I don't think has any hits on it, but it really is pointed at by many people as the first heavy metal album. Certainly heavier music was becoming more and more popular. Led Zeppelin, who I don't consider a heavy metal group by any means, but they certainly were a heavy group. Heavy blues on those first two albums of theirs especially, before they kind of tripped out on Led Zepp 3. So Black Sabbath, heavy metal thunder? That line from Born to Be Wild by Steppenwolf was about 67, 68? And so there have been allusions to heavy metal and stuff, but Black Sabbath 1 is pointed at by a lot of people as the first true heavy metal album. So if you're an aficionado, you owe it to yourself to seek out that album and have a listen. Just as a sign of how much music has changed since 1970, where, now it's like, obviously I haven't listened to American radio. I still don't think you can say fuck on American radio. I don't think you can say, maybe you can say shit. I know you can say bitch because it's like every rap song has that word in it. But anyway, so much more is permissible now than used to be. And as an example, Janis Joplin, a famous bluesy female singer, of course, was fined $200 for obscene language at a concert in Florida in 1970. Which would just never happen today. Obviously, these rap groups and people like Eminem and even other even the Foo Fighters or whatever go out and just say whatever they want now in concert, and there's no restrictions. So it was a different world. All right, moving on to this way. Beatles news. Paul McCartney, one of the Beatles, announced the breakup of the Beatles officially on April 10th of 1970. So I can say I was alive when the Beatles were a group. I was an infant, but I was there. And guess what happened on April 20th? He dropped his first solo album. That came out. It's called McCartney. I like it. I'm a fan of it. It's very stripped down. It's kind of like him with like a 4-track machine, just playing some songs. A little bit of Linda in there, his wife. And the big single is Maybe I'm Amazed. Maybe I'm Amazed. So great piano song. That went to #1 or so. But I like a lot of the other little tracks on there too. And I guess it kind of pissed off the other Beatles because Let It Be, their final studio album, came out in May. So he kind of usurped their position on the charts for a little bit. But they were releasing singles, Let It Be, Long and Winding Road, Across the Universe, Get Back. All those songs are on Let It Be. So, great album. Not a huge favorite album of mine as far as Beatles go. And I think I told this story before that they recorded Let It Be before Abbey Road. So a lot of Beatle fans, hardcore fans, consider Abbey Road their final album, even though it was released prior to Let It Be, because they put all the tapes of all the music on the shelf and Let It Be. Nobody could go through and edit it. Nobody wanted to try to make an album out of all this jam sessions and stuff they had been doing for this documentary that Paul was wanting them to film, which got released as the Let It Be movie, which isn't very good. It's hard to get. It's not available on DVD or VHS or anything. It might be somewhere online, YouTube or Vimeo or something. You're not missing much, though. I've seen it. You have to be a real hardcore fan to want to sit through it. But the album, I like it. But again, like I said, there's a lot of Phil Spector on it. So he's the guy they hired to come in finally and make an album out of it. George Martin really didn't want to have anything to do with it. He was their longtime producer. And Phil Spector is famous for his wall of sound, his production on the Ronettes and some 60s groups and the Righteous Brothers. Oh my God, the stuff he added to their songs, like Lost That Love and Feelin'. Anyway, he added strings, he added chorus stuff, he did change the songs, and so Paul was never a big fan, but he had sort of left the group, as I had mentioned, before it got released. Didn't really have a say anymore. They released it. So he went back years later in the early 2000s and released an album called Let It Be Naked. And it's basically just all the songs stripped back of all the Phil Spector production and just the four instruments. The guitar, the bass, the piano, the drums. And I like some of those versions a lot. So there you go. Every time you listen to Let It Be, it's like on the Passmasters, on the album, on Naked. It's like there's a different George Harrison's guitar solo. So if you're a real fan, you can listen to that and go, oh yeah, it's a little different, isn't it? All right, what other albums came out that I like in 1970? I'm a huge Who fan, and they released probably one of the greatest rock and roll live albums of all time called Live at Leeds. And Leeds, Leeds, is a city, and I believe a college in England. I was about to say London, but I don't know that it's in London. It's in England somewhere. And they put on a concert there, and it is fantastic. I remember buying it. It was only like 7 tracks when they first put it out. And it was very muddy sounding. The acoustics weren't that great, and they've since remastered it and extended it, and you get the whole concert now on CD, and it sounds great, and it is just fucking rock and roll, man. It is just so good. So if you like the Who, or you just like hard rock and roll, their version of Magic Bus on that album is amazing. The interplay between Keith Moon and Pete is fantastic. John just with that amazing bass line, and Roger just in great form. I love that album. So, my favorite live album of all time, though, Stop Making Sense by the Talking Heads, probably, if I had to pick one. Very different album, but I love that album to pieces. Another great single, it came off of an album, but it's mostly the single, because I'm a huge Kinks fan, is Lola. Came out in 1970. And of course, Ray Davies had to change, for the American market, change it from Coca-Cola because of copyright reasons to Cherry Cola in the song. And it's a pretty twisted song if you've never really sat down and listened to what he's talking about. Transgender issues early on. Just like a Walk on the Wild Side, perhaps by Lou Reed. But it's just such a fun song. And a lot of you might, if you're younger, you might go, wait, I know that song. Oh, wait, isn't that Yoda by Weird Al? So, yeah, of course, Weird Al has copied it. But it's a great song. Big concert that happened in 1969 that we talked about in episode 1 was Woodstock. And the big concert that happened in 1970 happened over in England on a little island. I think you have to take a ferry to get there, called the Isle of Wight. And that's not W-H-I-T-E, but I believe it's W-I-G-H-T. And just this huge outdoor concert. But they wanted people to pay. It wasn't going to be free. So they set up these huge, like, steel, like, fences and stuff to kind of separate the outside from the inside of the concert. And they had police dogs and stuff roaming the perimeter. And the hippies and the, free love and, music should be free, man, got really upset about it. It was a really contentious festival. I really didn't know much about it until I watched this really great documentary that's on YouTube about Joni Mitchell. I love Joni Mitchell. Her album Blue, it's phenomenal. And she went, and they asked her to perform, in the daytime at around 4 o'clock because some of the other acts fell through or couldn't make it. And, it's just her, this kind of, she's not frail, but she's just kind of a smaller woman, just in a plain dress. She goes out there with an acoustic guitar and a microphone, and there's literally like 500,000 people in this sea of people out there who are not really having it. They're yelling, and they're not paying her respect, and she tries to sing, and then she kind of gets angry at them, and it's this really interesting hour-long documentary. They only show about 6 of her songs. She didn't play that many songs, but there's all this behind-the-scenes footage of what was going on, and these people wigging out, and it's really fascinating. So it had a huge lineup, though. She, of course, did Big Yellow Taxi and Woodstock and Both Sides Now and a bunch of her big hits. So if you like Joni, definitely seek that out. But, of course, The Who were there. Hendrix was there. Dylan, The Doors. So there's probably individual documentaries or stuff about all of them. I think you can buy just The Who set as an album, Who Live at the Isle of Wight. So that was the big one, but a real different sort of flavor than Woodstock, which is, hey, man, peace, love, and happiness. And this one was like, you and your corporate greed, man, And, of course, the tickets probably weren't that expensive because I'm going to talk about Glastonbury started in 1970, the festival, and tickets were £1, £1, which is probably about $2.50 back then. So, yeah, you can't really complain that much. The sad news that was happening in music in 1970 was the death of both Jimi Hendrix, who died of an overdose in London on September 18th, and the death of Janis Joplin about 3 weeks later on October 4th. She died of a heroin overdose. And they were both 27. So this has started, along with some deaths of some other notable musicians, the Club 27, or the Cult of 27. It even has its own Wikipedia page, if you've never heard about this. And it's famous people, mostly musicians, who have died at the age of 27. It started with Brian Jones, who was the guitarist for the Rolling Stones, and did that famous bit on Paint It Black, and he died 27. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, age 27. And then it kind of resurged years later because Kurt Cobain died when he was 27, and Amy Winehouse died when she was 27. So you can go see, there's a whole list. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about it now. I'll talk about it when we talk about the death of John Lennon in 1980, when we get to that year and how sad that was. But I really don't like it when people compare Kurt Cobain to John Lennon. The way they died is completely different and has completely different meaning. And as much as you might be a Nirvana fan, and as much as grunge did change music, I cannot even fathom the comparisons of what, Kurt published and sang about compared to John Lennon. It's just, there is no comparison there. So, anyway, but tragically, we think 27. I'm 50 almost. So I'm almost double that. And they were taken from us at 27, or they took themselves out of it, if you think about an overdose maybe. But however your feelings are on that, just way too soon. All right. In jazz, we had a great album by Miles Davis called Bitches Brew. I've heard it a few times. I'm not a huge jazz fan. I'm not a musician, so I can't speak to the impact this had and stuff. If you're into jazz and you want to tell me a little bit about it in the comments or whatever. I wish we could still make comment videos and people could comment back. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of his Kind of Blue album, which came out in 1959, Miles Davis. Bitches Brew, I think, even expanded with double record set, more experimental. You know, I mean, it's the 70s now. So if you're into jazz, it's definitely one you should check out. And then favorite albums of mine that came out in 1970, not necessarily top of the charts, but Van Morrison's Moondance. Moondance is probably in my top 10 albums of all time. It's my second favorite Van Morrison album. My favorite is Astral Weeks. But Moondance is an amazing album. And I've given it as presents to a lot of people. I've given it away as a Valentine's gift to people because it's the most romantic album, like, of all time. I've given it as wedding presents for the same reason to couples and said, here, if you don't own this, put this on, you know, when you guys, you know, are you know, not feeling the greatest, and it'll make you remember how much you love each other. And yeah, I just think it's a masterpiece. The title track, Into the Mystic, Caravan, Crazy Love, so many of the songs you might know from movies. And he was just at the peak of his powers. Can't highly recommend it enough. It's an amazing album. Elton John's first album really came out. He had an album, Skyline Pigeon, called, what was the album called? Skyline Pigeon was the single. Empty Sky, maybe? No. Anyway, doesn't matter. His first real album that a lot of people consider his first big album is Elton John, Eponymous, and it has Your Song on it, which is probably one of his most famous songs, something he's probably had to play in concert a gajillion times over the past 50 years. And his first 2 or 3 albums, Elton, he had this arranger orchestrator named Paul Buckmaster, and he just works wonders with Elton's melodies. And of course, you know, Bernie Taupin writes the words, then Elton makes the music, and then there's just layers of, like, orchestra. So it's very produced and everything, but I love it. There's a great song on Elton John called Take Me to the Pilot, which is just incomprehensible, but it's just so kind of weirdly funky and just amazing. I love that, a song. I'm a big Cat Stevens fan. Tea for the Tillerman came out, one of his better albums. Layla by Derek and the Dominoes, the supergroup with Eric Clapton. Layla, of course, the single used predominantly, or prominently, I should say, sorry, not predominantly, but prominently in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, and they just use the coda, you know, the song Layla, and then they go, and then it drops, and then the piano comes in, and then it starts again for about 3 minutes. So good. CCR had yet another big album called Cosmos Factory. I think Run to the Jungle is on there. I mean, they just kept putting out albums. And then a kind of song style that sort of a lot of people think of when they think of the early 70s. You know, you think of singer-songwriters, you know, but like Motown was kind of ending, British Invasion was kind of ending. We hadn't really seen the ascendancy of Bruce Springsteen yet, and some of that type of rock and roll. And in there, in the, say, 70 to 75, the Carpenters were a very, very popular band. And it's Richard and Karen, brother and sister. Richard wrote the songs mostly and played and arranged. And of course, Karen had that voice from heaven. I mean, I just... I love listening to her sing. She was, again, taken from us too soon in her early 30s. So hopefully I'll get to talk to you about them again. But yeah, Close to You is the album that came out. And it has, you know, some fairly upbeat numbers on it. And Close to You is a very romantic song. But when you really listen to a lot of Carpenter songs, Goodbye to Love and Rainy Days and Mondays and stuff, they're sort of dark. It's really interesting if you listen to the words, like how dark some of these songs are. And she just delivers them so beautifully. Her voice is so pure, and her enunciation and everything, that she's on the sort of holy trinity, what I call it, of karaoke bands in Japan. If you go to karaoke and you're with foreigners, you can sing anything, because we all know each other's music for the most part. Although I had never heard of S Club 7. Oh boy, before I went with British Jets to karaoke one night, and boy did I get introduced. Yeah, if you go with Japanese people, it's kind of hard sometimes because they're going to sing songs in Japanese, and they've never heard of, Beck or Radiohead, or, I mean, some of them have, of course, but especially if you go with older colleagues and stuff. But here's the 3 bands you can always sing in English, but your Japanese coworkers will join you and sing along, and they'll know the songs. The Beatles, of course, Hello, Goodbye, any Beatles song, really. You're safe. The Queen, because Bohemian Rhapsody, the movie, was just past an anime movie about Detective Conan to become the #1 movie released at the box office in Japan in 2018. It's made almost $100 million here, which is huge for a tiny island nation like, well, not tiny, but fairly tiny island nation like Japan. They love Freddie Mercury and Queen here, so you can get away with a Queen song always. And the third is the Carpenters. If you can sing a Carpenter song, or you put a Carpenter song up there, people will sing along and they'll know it, especially if they're over, say, 25. Kids nowadays maybe not so much, but she's used a lot in English classes. Okay, everyone, let's learn an English song, let's sing along or whatever. So yeah, Carpenters. And then Paul had his solo album released in April of 1970, and John had his first real solo album released in December of 1970. Now, John had put out some albums with Yoko Ono, like 2 Virgins, and they're just kind of playing around, and it's not really music you want to listen to. Plastic Ono Band, his first real solo album, which came out in December, I consider his debut solo record, and it is a really amazing record with some great songs on it. 2 of my all-time favorites are on it, Working Class Hero and God. Now, God, I didn't really know that well until the Imagine documentary came out in the 80s, and then U2 sort of reworked it and did their own version of it on Rattle and Hum. And those 2 kind of things made me actually go out and seek it out, and that's when I first heard Plastic Ono Band. Yeah, Working Class Hero. Recently, Green Day did a version of Working Class Hero as a charity record for victims in Darfur. So, I can't say enough. John Lennon, just genius, and great record. Okay, some of the hits that weren't, necessarily songs that I would know that well, but they were the big hits of 1970, would include In the Summertime by Mungo and Jerry, or Mungo Jerry. I think it's Mungo and Jerry. Venus by Shocking Blue. I think they were a one-hit wonder. Venus, of course, got remade in the 80s by an all-girl British group called Bananarama, or Bananarama. And so you might have heard it. And then Diana Ross had her first big hit after she left the Supremes, the all-girl group from Motown. She did a version of a song that I think was originally done by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, and it's called Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and it is a fantastic song, and Diana works it. So yeah, that's a great song for her. The Jackson 5, in that vein, also had a big album come out that year that had the hits ABC and I'll Be There. I'll Be There is on there. Tears of a Clown, an all-time favorite of mine. I love Smokey Robinson. I just think he has, talk about Karen Carpenter's voice of an angel. Smokey Robinson has just a voice from nowhere. It's just amazing. The range and just the sweetness and Second That Emotion by Smokey Robinson is one of the all-time great songs ever. But Tears of the Clown, let me play a little bit of Tears of Clown for you.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Now if there's a smile on my face, it's only there trying to fool the public.
Right. Love that song. And it was remade by one of my all-time favorite 80s groups, the English Beat, as kind of a ska version of it. So yeah, it keeps coming around. And lastly, in music, and we'll shut it off here at the 30-minute mark, is Cracklin' Rosie, the first #1 on the Billboard chart for my man Neil Diamond. I'm a huge Neil Diamond fan. That comes from my parents. My mom loved him. He was my first ever rock concert, if you want to call it a rock concert, pop concert. I went with her and saw him in, I want to say 78, 79. I was probably 9 or 10. Anyway, love Neil, and Cracklin' Rosie is a great song. So that was his first #1. He had, of course, written songs in the 60s and before his solo career. Like, he had written I'm a Believer for the Monkees and had some other hits. Red, Red Wine, that eventually got remade by UB40. Is a Neil song, but yeah, Cracklin' Rosie was his first solo #1. All right, let's cut here, and we'll start again with films in 1970 up next. Okay, and we'll continuing our look at 1970. We're not going to jump into movies, and let's just start at the chart with the highest grossing movies at the American box office in 1970, the year that started the decade. Love Story was #1. Love Story, really, really cute girl, Ally McGraw, gets cancer. And she dies. Spoilers. No, it's one of those tragic love stories. I think it just took a hold of the zeitgeist at the moment. Has the famous line, love means never having to say you're sorry, or something like that. I don't know. It was based on a book, and it got made into a movie with two really good-looking leads, and made a lot of money. So there you go. Airport was #2. Now, Airport is not Airplane. Okay, Airplane is the amazing Zucker Brothers comedy that we'll get to when we get to like 1979 or 1980. And it's a parody of Airport. And they made Airport, they made a bunch of them. But this is the original. It came out in 1970, and it's really what you think it is. Plane takes off, big jumbo jet full of passengers. Something goes wrong, but it's not like a terrorist or anything, and they have to find a way to land and save everyone. But some of the exact things that happen in Airplane, I think, happen in Airport, where like the pilots are down by bad food, and this and that and the other is going on with the passengers. But it was taken very seriously. It was like it's this sort of trend of disaster movies that were very popular in the 70s. You had The Boat That Turned Over, Poseidon Adventure. You had the Towering Inferno, the big high-rise that caught on fire. You had a movie called Earthquake, which is about an earthquake. So this is one of those. I think it started the trend, really. #3 movie is actually a great movie that I really do recommend you see, and it's MASH by Robert Altman. Robert Altman, fantastic director who did so many different types of movies. The Player, Shortcuts, Nashville. But MASH is a really great one from him. Now, of course, a lot of you know the TV show, Alan Alda's Hawkeye, and some of the same characters are in the movie. The movie's based directly on the book, which I also recommend if you've never read it and you want to read an interesting story. And this, of course, MASH is set in the Korean War, which is not a popular setting for war movies. You get a lot of World War II movies, and you get a lot of Vietnam movies, but not a lot are about Korea, which happened in 1950-51. And of course, if you don't know what MASH is, it stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. So it's the doctors that were kind of there on the front lines, and they could move around if they needed to. And as the guys got wounded on the front lines, they would be brought back by helicopter or Jeep ambulance to these mobile units that could then operate on them and hopefully save their lives and patch them up. Great movie, a lot of fun. I mean, really funny. It's a comedy, that's set in like the most dire circumstances ever. And there's a great football scene in it. It's R-rated. It's got, you know, nudity and drinking and language. But and I love the TV show, which obviously had to tone it down. But the TV show is really one of those rare things where you can say it's a drama that's funny. You know, the drama and comedies. People talk about dramedies all the time, but really MASH is one of the only ones that really holds that distinction and does it well. Another war film was number 4, and that's Patton. Patton won Best Picture that year. Best Actor for George C. Scott, who plays the general, the World War II general who was a tank commander and fought through Italy and up into Germany, Battle of the Bulge and stuff. Amazing. Notable now for history fans, film history buffs like me, because it was an early writing credit for Francis Ford Coppola, who, of course, a couple years later would make The Godfather. So he didn't direct Patton, but he did write the screenplay or co-wrote it with another person. Obviously based on true events. Patton, is a real person. George C. Scott is an interesting guy because he won, and he said, don't nominate me. I'm not interested in these awards. And they did, and he won, and he refused to accept it. He didn't go to the ceremony. And so I think the director got it on his behalf. And he was just, in the 70s, there was this kind of vein. Him and Dustin Hoffman are the two examples. And Marlon Brando, I think, also did this, where they were like, we're not in competition. We're all artists. We're all doing our best work. You can't tell me, I was good in my movie. This person was good in their movie. You can't tell me I'm better than that person, or I'm a better actor than that person. I just happen to have a good part, blah, blah, blah. So he refused it, but I think later in life he did finally let people give him Lifetime Achievement Awards and stuff like that. But he is amazing in the movie. The number 5 movie in 1970 was a documentary, which probably doesn't happen too much anymore nowadays. I mean, I can't even imagine a documentary being able to get into the top 10, let alone top 5, for the whole year. And that's the documentary about Woodstock. So the concert that happened in 1969. Again, this is another early training ground for Martin Scorsese, the director of Taxi Driver and Mean Streets, Raging Bull, and so on. He was a cameraman for this documentary and filmed a lot of the footage that ended up in the film. And it's great. If you've never seen it, it really captures what it was like, the chaos, all the people camping out. They couldn't get there because the roads were clogged. We never really had a big, huge music festival like Woodstock before. It was one of a kind, and they've tried to recreate it in modern times, but it's always seemed so corporate, and it's been at Air Force hangars, so it's all in concrete, and it's never going to be the same. The lineup they had and stuff, but good documentary. Then some other movies, and we jump all the way down to number 10, which is the Aristocats. Aristocats, not crats, cats. Never seen it. It's the one. I'm pretty sure it's the only Disney movie, animated Disney movie I've never seen. Sleeping Beauty, Dumbo, Cinderella, Jungle Book, Robin Hood. Of course, Snow White, Pinocchio, Bambi, all the movies before this, and then everything that kind of came in the wake after, even Fox and the Hound, Black Cauldron, Oliver and Company, and then into the Renaissance, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King. I've seen everything. I love animated movies, I love Disney movies, but I've never seen the Aristocats, and I just don't really have any desire to. Somebody down in the comments tell me, is it worth my time? Should I go back as a 50-year-old man and see this movie? First of all, I don't like cats. So it just never appealed to me. I didn't see it when I was young. I just never rented it for some reason. I don't have children, so it's not like, hey, let's watch all the Disney movies, this year or something. So yeah, I've just never seen it. But it made some money. I mean, back then, of course, the movies would roll out, and they wouldn't be huge like they are now, where The Incredibles make $600 million or some amazing amount of money. And then they'd get re-released every 7 or 8 years. They'd come back into theaters for a couple weeks or whatever, because there was no VHS and there was no home video back then. And so that's how I saw some of my early Disney films in the 70s. Because they didn't release that many new movies. I think Aristocats, I know Robin Hood was one I went to see. But it was kind of the age when Disney was making some interesting live action. And we'll get to that when we get to those years. Herbie, the Love Bug, and Flubber, and the Apple Dumpling Gang, and Escape to Witch Mountain, which I loved, and stuff like that. All right, IMAX, which is a format I love nowadays, and you think about it, made its debut in Japan in 1970. I would really like to know what that was like, because certainly nothing was shot and meant to be IMAX yet. Now they, of course, have IMAX cameras and everything. I remember, of course, my early IMAX was going to, like, the planetarium in Balboa Park, or I think there was one, too, in Texas that I went to. And, you know, they would shine the whole dome, and they would put the movie up, and it was always like a nature documentary or something about space. And they were like half an hour because, you know, the camera was so expensive to use and whatnot. They couldn't shoot a whole movie that way. And now, really, this modern day, I think it started with The Dark Knight, and Christopher Nolan wanted to use the camera for The Dark Knight back in like 2008 or something. You know, where they shoot movies and they shoot part of it in IMAX, and now they get shown in IMAX. And I love going to IMAX theater here in Japan. That's about a half an hour away from my house. And watching, you know, the Avengers, and even like Bohemian Rhapsody. I went there. It was great. The sound was loud and fantastic. But anyway, that all started in 1970. And then just one series I like in movies that got its second movie in 1970 is Beneath the Planet of the Apes. So I'm a big Planet of the Apes fan, and I have the movie. Do you want to see the movies? Okay, hold on one second. I have them. Okay, I went and got them. Planet of the Apes box set. So these are the 5 original films. And, of course, Planet of the Apes. Okay, Charlton Heston. Rod Serling from Twilight Zone fame wrote the screenplay. And then they did the sequel. And they couldn't get Charlton for the whole movie. So they got this guy. Whoa, I just dropped a bunch. They got this other guy. And Charlton Heston's only in about a half an hour of the movie. And he dies. And they kind of blow up the planet. So spoilers. But yeah, it's not great. But then the next 2 are really good. Escape and Conquest. I really like both of those a lot. And then the last one is not so good either. So I'd say 3 out of 5 of the original trilogy is really good. And then I can't say enough about Rise, Dawn, the new 3, the 3 trilogy that came out with Caesar and, you know, all that. Oh, I just love those movies. So I'm a huge Planet of the Apes fan. But anyway, Beneath Planet of the Apes came out, trying to find a way to keep the franchise going, and I'm glad they did, because even though the second one that came out that year wasn't very good, 3 and 4 were really good. All right, let's cut and say transition maybe. No, we'll just keep going and talk about world events. And this is going to wrap up this chat about 1970. Thanks for watching. Hope you're enjoying it. Nixon, our man Nixon, President of the United States, bans all cigarette ads on TV. So there was a time you used to be able to, you know, have a commercial on television. You know, Marlboro, man, that's my brand, you know. And I just remember going on flights in the 70s from America to England, and people could smoke on the airplane. And, like, you know, you're in a tube. You know, they have a section, like a non-smoking section. Come on. So that was ridiculous. But yeah, no cigarette ads on television anymore. The U.S. population, I just saw, they took a census, I think, in 1970. Crossed 200 million people. It was 203 million people. So compared to now, I want to say we're at about 350 million in America, but I'm not sure if that's right. If you want to correct me, please, in the comments. The world population in 1970 was 3.69 billion, and I believe it's doubled since 1970. So in 50 years, we've added another like 3.5 billion people, and we're now around 7 billion people on the planet. And that's scary. That's a lot of people That's a lot of stress, a lot of sustainability issues, and we'll get to that. Luckily, people were starting to think about the planet back in 1970, and we celebrated the very first Earth Day in 1970 in April, where you try to maybe go out and do something nice for the Earth or plant a tree, recycle, or something like that. We talked in 1969 a lot about my fascination with Apollo 11 and the landing on the moon. Well, Apollo 13, which is another great movie and a story you're probably familiar with from that film with Tom Hanks, happened in 1970. Jim Lovell and his crew tried to get up to the moon, couldn't land. Houston, we have a problem, and had to come back. Luckily, they all survived. But great film. If you've never seen Apollo 13 by Ron Howard, you definitely should see it. In some sad news, in May of 1970, we had the Kent State shootings. So Kent State is a university in Ohio in America, and there was protests for the Vietnam War, students protesting. They brought in the National Guard, which is guys that, well, mostly guys back then, maybe there's women now too, who kind of give up their weekends to train as military soldiers to be brought in when they're needed in American situations, so they don't have to actually join the army, but they kind of can get credit, and I don't know the whole ins and outs of it. But anyway, so they're less maybe experienced, depending on how long they've been in the service, etc. And they were brought in to kind of keep the protests from getting out of hand, etc. And they ended up shooting 4 of the students, killing 4 of them. And 9 other people were wounded. Very, very tragic, and just not at all what anyone would have wanted out of that situation. And, just showing how divisive the Vietnam War was in America at that time. Still is, really, for a lot of people. In sports news, Brazil won the 1970 World Cup, which took place in Mexico. I believe Pelé was on the squad then, one of the best soccer players of all time. And, of course, Brazil, no stranger to winning. Either them or Germany is the one country that's won the most World Cups. So it only happens every 4 years. So in 1970, we had one, and it was in Mexico. Congratulations, Brazil. Another sport thing they had was the very first New York City Marathon. Running was getting popular. Jogging, this idea that you would just go out and run for pleasure and or exercise was kind of a new idea. And of course it came with the invention of the Nike and the running shoe and just this whole idea about it. And the marathon, the very first New York City Marathon. I mentioned Glastonbury had its first music festival. Very different back then. I think only about 1,500 people came out. T-Rex was the headliner. Tickets were £1, so $2.50 about. Yeah, and I don't think I think it was a one-day event back then. Now, of course, it's like Coachella. It goes on for like 3 days, and huge headliners. Paul McCartney's played there, David Bowie, Oasis. Everybody's played Glastonbury, basically. Monday Night Football started in 1970. So in American football, we used to have the AFL, the American Football League, and the NFL, the National Football League. They combined, so we had one kind of central NFL league, and then we had the AFC and the NFC within that. And so the AFC and the NFC would have a championship game, the Super Bowl, and they had 2 or 3 of those. I think the 1970 Super Bowl was maybe Super Bowl 3. But anyway, Monday Night Football started. One of my favorite all-time announcers, sports announcers, Howard Cosell, who did a lot of boxing. You associate him with Muhammad Ali, but he was also on Monday Night Football. Loved to watch that. Me and my dad, especially after we moved to Texas, which is football crazy in 77. We used to watch Monday Night Football just all the time. Loved it. Another great thing started on TV in 1970, PBS. The Public Broadcasting System began in 1970. So PBS, for those of you who don't know, if you're not in America, is the channel. There was only like 3 channels back then: ABC, NBC, CBS, and then you could get PBS like on like 11, or something. And then you'd have UHF channels, which would just be like little local stations that would show like old movies and reruns of Gilligan's Island and stuff. PBS, Public Broadcasting System, no commercials. So no ads, no support that way. They would get their money from a grant from the government, so they had to educate people, put on programming that was designed to help children or help people learn. So a lot of masterpiece theater, live opera, and of course the shows that started that informed my youth so heavily would be things like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, Electric Company later. So I love PBS. And then of course for me, when I got to be a teenager, PBS was the station that would play all this wacky British stuff. Benny Hill, Monty Python, Vicar of Dibley, just all kinds of things. And of course Downton Abbey more recently was on PBS. So PBS, big thing. Love it. Often donated money to them. Try to keep them going. I'm sure Trump is trying to defund them somehow. Vietnam, of course, the backdrop to many a news story over each night in America. Nixon finally does withdraw for 40,000 troops in 1970, and there's actually a week for the first time since the fighting started in like 1965, where there's a whole week where there's not a single American fatality. So that's a good sign, but there's of course awful things happening as well, like the My Lai massacre comes to light and some of those things. So Vietnam, certainly huge issue. And Ken Burns' amazing documentary about Vietnam, it's like 8 parts, it's a lot of watching, but it's a lot of information, is now on Netflix, I believe, so you can see it for free if you're a Netflix member. Ronald Reagan, big figure in politics. A lot of people don't remember, before he was president, governor of California. So where I was living, where I grew up, he was the governor. He got reelected to a second term as governor in 1970. And in Japan, the one big event, and I should have looked up more about this, is the Mishima event. So a man whose last name is Mishima wanted to protest, wanted the emperor to be reinstated, even though this was, 1970, so we're, 25 years after World War II, 45, 55, yeah, 25 years. He and some friends or colleagues or something took over a building or took over a military place, something. It became obvious that he wasn't going to succeed, like he wasn't going to get what he wanted, and so he killed himself, I don't know, in front of people or something. I really should know more about this before I'm talking about it. But anyways, it's an interesting story. They've since made a movie about it, etc. But if you're interested in it, just look up Mishima, IMA, sorry, and you'll find him and be able to read about it. So that was a big story in Japan, which is, of course, where I live now. So that's it. I feel like I've gone over a lot of stuff. This is 20 minutes plus the other 30, so we're at 50 minutes. So again, I apologize. It's a lot to get through, but hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm going to do my best. It's the 30th today, so tomorrow's 31st, my deadline. I'm going to put in all the clips and put in everything and make it all kind of visually more interesting than just my face. In case you couldn't tell, on my tie is Spider-Man. You see him there? Yay. So I hope you're having a good week, and I really am going to try now at the weekend when I can open this curtain and do these during the daytime and have less of this light on and more sunlight, hopefully, and film them, during the day, and then, edit them, and then hopefully maybe put out one every 1 or 2 weeks, but we'll see. Anyway, if you watch this one all the way to the end, what do you get? You get a Spider-Man salute. Yay. Thank you for watching. I'll be coming back with number 3, 1971, and I definitely will read your comment if you want to leave me any suggestions or feedback. I'd love to hear from you down in the description, down in the comment area. And like I said, I'll put those timestamps in the description. Okay, guys, peace. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Episode 3.